Good afternoon, everybody. It is great to be here. My name is Sandra McCroom, and currently I run an organization right here in Roxbury called Children's Services of Roxbury. It is the largest Black-led organization in the Commonwealth. Our headquarters are right here in Roxbury, but we operate out of 4 cities across the Commonwealth, employ about 400 citizens of the Commonwealth, and serve 6,000 children and their families annually. And just prior to becoming the CEO there, I was the Undersecretary of Criminal Justice in the Patrick administration. And while we were doing criminal justice reform and thinking about how to think about prisoner reentry, and we used to call it returning citizens. So when, I don't know if people still call it that. I like to take credit for that, but
we'll give it to
you. But we actually here in the same building, we ran a big conference where that became the phrase. But I'm not sure that we were the originators. So, but in that work, we always talked about the best reentry program is no entry. And so my law enforcement friends say, well, how could you move into the child welfare space? And I see it as one continuum that I'll talk more about later, that a child could matriculate from, being in a foster care system where society feels like we got to embrace them and love them and give them a safe home. And the minute that child commits a crime or gets accused of a crime, sometimes they just become a defendant and continues the trauma that we'll talk more about from, having been taken away from somebody's home or from their home and into a system that doesn't always recognize trauma. And so I feel like I'm on the front end of trying to prevent children from growing up and having those experiences and maybe even ending up in the criminal justice system. So I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eddy Chrispin. My title and position right now is with the Boston Police Department. I am a Deputy Superintendent in charge of Internal Affairs. I always say that, but I always go back and tell people that's not what defines me. Before I became a police officer, I worked in social services, both in DSS, I worked in DYS, I worked in probation, I worked in a number of community-oriented programs, violence prevention programs, and mentoring programs. And then the other piece of my job is I hope to transition the next few weeks into a role as the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for the Boston Police Department. So we'll see how that works. It's going from tough work to even tougher work. So thank you for being here. I'm not going to say a lot about let me just take a step back. I'm originally from Haiti. I came here at the age of 7. So an immigrant, learned the language, went to Boston Public Schools, went to college here. During college, I did a lot of work in the community because I've always been interested in doing community work and not deterring some of the things I saw growing up. I grew up in Mattapan in the 80s, and there was a lot of stuff going on in Boston. When I graduated from college, I worked for the Department of Social Services. For those of you who are old enough to remember the old Mission Hill housing complex before it changed, I worked for DSS, and I think I was the only one bold enough to go in there. After doing that, I left and went to law school, did some work in law school, mostly along community-oriented work. I was awarded a Thurgood Marshall Fellow scholarship because of all the community work I had done. I went on to work in a disabilities law clinic, and I came back here, and I've been here. I think I always tell people my reason for joining the police department was always about change before people really started talking about change in the police department. And here I am 22 years later, hopefully at the hub of the change, trying to really push some of those things that I'd seen historically as being problems with the police department. So that's a little bit about me. Welcome, and I hope we will keep you entertained, and and you'll have a lot of good questions for us. So this is always a learning experience for me when I take part in these panels. So.
That was all awesome. My name is Nigel Jacob. I am a fellow at the Burns Center, which is a new university-wide center here at Northeastern, focused on social impact and change. But before that, for many years, I worked in the Boston Mayor's office, co-leading the mayor's or many mayors' innovation team called the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics. And through that work, I did a lot of collaboration with Dan O'Brien and Catherine and others at other universities. And so a lot of that work was about trying to, is exactly what the conference is about, trying to build collaborations across institutional barriers. And so I just wanted to restate that because I think sometimes it gets sort of lost in the discussion. And as a quick reminder, one of the themes here today is the idea of developing or thinking in terms of civic research agendas, which may be a bit of an abstract notion, but the idea is that all of the communities in Boston, and there are many, it depends on who you ask, how many neighborhoods you have in Boston. But there are questions that we need to be asking about how things do or don't happen and how people are or aren't included. And so we need to, so I think that's a useful notion to keep on the back burner, sort of this notion about, it's not only about what's happening, but like, what do we need to know about what is happening? What questions do we need to be digging deeper into? So we'll just give our amazing panel a hand. And we're very grateful, and we're grateful for our friends at the Institute for Racial Justice for sponsoring the panel. And so the way that we thought we would ask, we would lead off with a broad overview and sort of a term-setting discussion about this notion of community trauma and trauma in general. Because as the deputy superintendent was just saying before, that trauma is a very often used notion or word, especially now that there is so much of it. But what are we actually talking about? So Charlene, would you?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think trauma over the years I find has become almost like a trendy word. A lot of people are using it, right? But what gets confusing is how people understand it, right? And so for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to set the frame of what we're talking about. And I'm going to keep it simple. Trauma is 3 E's, right? It's an event that is experienced that has effects on an individual person, right? And trauma can be experienced differently by anybody. For example, the 3 of us can be in a car, right? And we're in a car accident. I could leave the car accident feeling fine, right? Sandra could leave, like, really having some anxiety after the car accident, like, I'm not okay. And Eddy could leave, like, I'm never getting in the car again, right? We've all experienced the same event, but we've had different reactions, and that's for a number of reasons, right? That could be because we've had previous experiences with car accidents. They could be because we have certain protective factors in place that will make us a little bit easier, will help us really withstand the accident itself, right? Or it could be what we've seen before. So there's a number of reasons why we may be reactive. So when we consider trauma, again, the 3 E's, the event, the experience, and effects, one of the key takeaways that I always tell people is let the individual or person define it for themselves, right? We're not here to tell you, and I see this often, oh my God, you had this terrible event, you must be traumatized, right? You know, when we're talking about trauma, there's been, obviously when we're talking about PTSD, which is kind of on a continuum of trauma, we're talking about very specific symptoms in order to get that diagnosis. Today, we're just going to really have a general conversation about trauma. Okay. So does everybody understand 3 E's? Should I convince you guys? Right.
Sorry, just interrupting. We have some comments on the Zoom that they're having trouble hearing the speakers, so I'm just trying to like speak as loud as possible.
Sure. Okay. Well, yes.
I wanted to just apologize ahead of time. My daughter has gotten locked out of our home, and so that's why Eddy was speaking. I know he was like, "What's she doing on the phone?" I just want to make she may come to the door and make buzz. I just wanted to say that. I don't want my people.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, you're good. You're good.
While we're confessing, I'm taking notes on my phone, so I don't want you to think I'm like, okay, word search up here.
What's interesting, this is great, right? Because this signifies this is a safe space, right? And one of the key components of when you're starting to address trauma is creating that sense of safety, right? So it sounds like we have some of that in this room today. So that means we're gonna have an interesting conversation about this. But we were thinking about kind of the way people really understand trauma, right? And so when we talk about trauma, people really start thinking about it from the individual perspective. When we have these sessions, you hear something terrible happens to someone, whether it's an act of violence, whether it's, the sudden death or loss of someone, or someone has been significantly harmed, we often start from the standpoint of the individual, right? What has happened to that person? And then, when we start from that perspective, as a clinician, one of the things that I first do when I consider someone who may be exhibiting symptoms of trauma, and that could be a range of things, right? And so for some people may be familiar, some people may not, but trauma can manifest very differently in individuals, right? From a behavioral perspective, from a cognitive perspective, from an emotional perspective, and so on. So some examples of that is that people who experience trauma may start having trouble sleeping, or you may see some disturbances in eating, or even just difficulty concentrating, or shifts in moods and emotion, right? And so those are things that somebody can come to me and say, hey, I've been experiencing these symptoms, right? And so once we identify what the symptoms are, we start doing an assessment. And part of the assessment is gathering information. How long have you experienced these symptoms? You start gathering historical information, data, right? What has happened to you? Tell me about your family. What are some of the things that are getting in the way for you? So you may have trouble. Well, ever since I had this car accident, every time I go to work, I feel really anxious. Or every time I go to work, my bosses are telling me I'm not concentrating, and now it's getting in the way of my job. And I think I'm about to lose my job because I can't focus, right? So we can kind of define what some of those things look like with education and supporting the client. So after we do the assessment, we gather information, we start thinking about next steps, right? So that's our treatment plan. That's our strategy. What are the interventions we're going to think about to support the client in front of me? And we do it as a team in collaboration, right? And part of that treatment planning assessment is thinking about what are the current resources that exist to support the intervention, right? So when we were thinking about this presentation today, we were talking about those components, right? So there's a lot of intentionality that goes into addressing individual trauma, right? And so what would that look like if we took those same components and really started thinking about collective trauma or community trauma? We don't really have those conversations, right? Or we kind of don't really kind of define what community looks like, right? Community can be a neighborhood, it can be a community, it can expand in many different ways. And so, part of the conversation today that I'm hoping that we can push you guys to really start thinking about too is like, how do we think about community trauma or collective trauma in the same way we think about addressing individual trauma? Does that make sense to you?
That sounds great.
Okay. I like the feedback, so you guys can ask questions or whatever as we go along the way. And so how do we really think about it? And one of the things that comes to mind often is what happened several years ago with George Floyd. Okay. I think that example, unfortunately, is an example that we can utilize that demonstrates the impact of community trauma. How many people in this room, after bearing witness to that horrific incident, if you did, started feeling things? Anybody feel certain types of emotions or had thoughts, right? Anybody feel a sense of like confusion, or ask the question, why did this happen? How did this happen? So even though we weren't, I'm guessing many of us were not there, but we witnessed it. There was a sense of like a collective trauma that was felt not only in that individual city, in that community, but really across the country. Right? And then we saw a lot of mobilization. So when we think about community trauma, you know, there is sometimes a connection between what's experienced individually and what can kind of impact the community as a whole. So there is this connection between the two. And so, you know, I think we have to kind of start thinking about like, what's the approach when we're thinking about community trauma, not only from violent acts, but from racial trauma, right? From thinking about the things that have happened systemically in this country around violence, around poverty, and injustices in the community. So I hope that like sets a little bit of the framework for further discussion about what we can do moving forward.
Any questions now? While still fresh in your mind, thoughts or reactions to that? Sort of articulation of trauma?
Question. I love this idea. I think it's so powerful. And I'm already thinking and wondering if you have a structure to it, because when I think about dealing with individuals, there's the structures that need to be in place, the processes that need to be in place, and then the personal clinical skills, right? So there's like all those layers when it's one-on-one, and I think we probably need something similar. And then the people part of it, the personal skills are going to have to deal with your own internalized racism if you're in a PWI kind of situation, as well as how you deal with trauma, right? So like, is that what we're thinking about? Like that kind of.
Well, I think the goal is to push us to think about those things, right? So we almost have like a prescription in some ways to addressing individual trauma, but not so much community trauma. And where does that come from? Again, we're talking about institutionalized practices that have harmed people. And with trauma, we're talking about harm, whether it's physical harm or emotional harm. We're talking about harm. And when we're talking about things related to like some of the intergenerational trauma that has crossed generations, around racial trauma, around poverty, around sexual violence, right? So those are things that have impacted large communities. But how do we kind of strategize and wrap around, in some ways, communities to address some of those things? I think that's the conversation that we're hoping to push people towards, so that we can think more intentionally about it.
Anybody else before we go? So, do you want to either respond to that or give us your thoughts?
Yeah, my thought is, I feel like you just put us all through a master class. And, right? Like if I can gain knowledge, just really osmosis, like you described us as experts, I would defer to that. Yeah. So my comment is, you had just mentioned generational trauma, and I think we have to think about it. And I'll tell a couple quick stories to bring it home and how I see my work now working in the community, having worked, you know, I oversaw DOC, parole, the Sex Offender Registry Board, which explains my short hair. The quick story I'll tell is when my oldest nephew graduated from high school, he called me and he said, Sandra, what are you doing for the next year? And I was like, what? What do you mean, what am I doing for the next year? He was asking if he could come live with me. He didn't know what he wanted to do after high school, and he did. He came to live with me. And during that time, if I say the name Oscar Grant, do you guys know who I'm talking about? That is so interesting. So I'm going to make a point, not that it's bad, but how many have not heard of Oscar Grant or remember who he is? So good chunk of the room. And so Oscar Grant, when I say Fruitvale Station, you'll probably remember there was a movie about him. It was New Year's Eve. He was on the train with his friends, and a police officer murdered him, right? And my nephew saw this on television, and you know, he's a guy's guy, whatever that means. Not very emotional, but he started sobbing. And I was like, what is wrong? And he just could not get over that a young man who looks like him, who's a good kid by all, you know, and the fact that we have to justify who's good and who isn't, who deserves to die and who doesn't, under what circumstances, it came pouring out of him about all of these things that were unfair. And, you know, to your point about seeing an event, feeling an event, experiencing an event, and what the effects were for him, the effects were, you know, that he felt all of these things kind of coming, rushing back. And I think about that in terms of generational trauma. I am the daughter of civil rights activists, and my father was a lawyer, a civil rights attorney. My mother's a registered nurse, but was very active in the civil rights movement. So you know, we're talking about the 60s. It is not the 60s. Things are better, what have you, except that, you know, I grew up understanding and knowing the Emmett Till story, knowing and seeing and understanding all of these traumatic things that have happened to a community I happen to belong to. So again, sort of this community experience, but generations of stories about traumatic events informed my nephew on that day. And it was more than Oscar Grant losing his life. And I see that over and over and over again. When you live walking through the world, wondering if, you know, you, by virtue of who you are, or what neighborhood you live in, or the perception that people have about you can impact whether you live or die, somewhere that is in the back of your mind. And so now I work at Children's Services of Roxbury. You know, 90% of the people I work with are people of color, and I would imagine the same is true. But I just think we have to understand a little bit about what people carry with them, whether they are conscious or have some level of subconsciousness about trauma that has happened and perpetuated itself over and over and over again. Again, thinking about that and thinking about how we collectively at least acknowledge and recognize some of those histories in particular communities. And it's not, I mean, I gave a story about, you know, African-American community, and again, post George Floyd, there's this magnification of that, but any community, you know, Asian Americans walking around getting pummeled because they, you know, certain Americans think they brought COVID over. They're like, really? You know, but how does that tie back to World War II and the internment camps? Like this, you know, history of trauma that lives somewhere in us. And every community, I'm sure, you know, has their own sort of story about that and how that manifests itself here and now. So anyway, I think that as we think about how do we respond to the trauma of 2 years of COVID, 2 years of isolation, 2 years of remote everything, how our children are responding to, you know, having been absent from their friends, that is on top of all the magnification of what COVID has taught us around some of the disparities. And those disparities are not isolated to, oh, we don't get the same healthcare as other communities, or, oh, nobody thought that it would be hard for people in Roxbury to go get a COVID test in Foxborough. Like who didn't consider that, right? So CSR, my agency, we opened a walk-through COVID testing because people were not getting on the bus, they were not getting, so where does that come from? How does that, and then how does that impact communities who have been disenfranchised and traumatized by systems that don't feel like they're built for us, right? Nobody thought. Now, eventually, there were COVID testing places were, localized, but, the idea that everybody had a car, everybody could drive out to Foxborough, everybody could have access to testing, to shots, is traumatizing as a whole, that these things, these inequities continue to happen to a community. So as we start to fix those, the idea of trust, the idea of trust of government, trust of people wanting to sort of help, like we've heard that, and still all of these I know microaggressions has become a sort of thing, like and almost too trendy to say anymore, but all these microaggressions that happen collectively to a community, whether it's the criminalization of being poor, the criminalization of being a woman wanting to, I won't go there, but wanting to control her own body, whether it's the criminalization of, you told me to be.
Yeah.
So, this history, I think, has to be considered when you think about trauma in a community, and why when somebody lays on the neck of George Floyd for 9.5 minutes, this eruption, not only of the inhumanity of it, no matter the race, but then how that reflects to a community like ours, who he was yet another man, because I knew Emmett Till, I knew the story, I knew, and then it's again, and now it's on full display, and that sense of hurt runs deep, right? And if you didn't have that generational sense of what has happened to a community, I mean, yeah, I was gonna say therein lies privilege. You can choose to experience that, and then you could step away and be like, well, that's there. So those are a lot of deep and sort of political, touch points that get, I think, talked about too much superficially, and not how generationally we experience trauma, like the 3 E's. So I would leave it there.
So that was amazing. Those are amazing stories. Wonderful framework for us to think about the 3 E's and thinking about trauma, individual trauma, and personal trauma, and collective trauma, community trauma. Powerful stories about what that looks like in the world and how we experience that. Reflections on this, Deputy Superintendent? You've worn so many hats.
I think that's, and I'll speak briefly as to how I come to understand trauma, right? I'm a Black man, grew up 70s, 80s, and 90s, where the notion of trauma didn't exist, right? And I'm from the islands, for those people who know West Indians. You grew up in a time your parents were like, hey, you get out there, you do what you need to do. You could be half dead, like both your arms cut up. You gotta get up and go to work, do what you need to do. So a lot of us never realized the trauma, right? It just didn't exist to us. And over the last few years, a lot of people who grew up in a time that, they just taught you how to deal with your trauma. Like if you're walking down the street, or, you go into a store, people give you a hard time because of what you look like, you walk out, you don't address it. So over the years, we've just been taught how to deal with these things and not voice them. Here I am, 50 plus years later, dealing with George Floyd as a Black man working for the police department, right? The first time I watched that video, I have 2 sons, all right? So and let me just give you some preface. People will say, well, these are young Black boys being killed. What do you know about that? I said, 2 Black sons, okay? And I've had to teach these 2 young Black men how to navigate the world in such a way that these kind of things don't happen, things that most people don't think about. And then above and beyond that, for me, being on the receiving end as a police officer, because oftentimes I've spoken about this at length over the last 2 years, when you put on the uniform, a lot of people think you lose your Blackness, right? And trying to navigate this world, and for me, and I've been very open about saying this, I'm Black before I'm blue, right? Because I take off the uniform, I walk out into the world, like nobody cares that I'm a cop. And I've been in spaces where I don't walk around with the badge on my forehead, I've gotten the same kind of treatment. So that's the lens, that's my lens of the world, right? I understand both sides of it and I try to be very vocal about this. Life experiences that, and we talked about this a little bit the other day, where do most of us first experience trauma? Right? It's usually in our own homes. It is generally imposed on us by people who probably went through the same type of trauma. How do we insert services so that, you know, they say hurt people hurt people, right? So that person who's gone through a lifetime of trauma, not understanding of this trauma, they're thinking that this is functional behavior. This is how I raise my kids. And let me take a step back. So for me, when I worked for DSS back then, which is now DCF, a large majority of my clients were people who look like me. And if you didn't know, people would say, well, why are Black people so much more harsh with their children, right? And you draw back, where did most Black people learn how to discipline their kids? It's based on what slave masters, how harsh they were. And to some extent, I've had this conversation with my father. He grew up in the islands. He was just one of those guys, you act up, you coming home, you gotta get it. And that's just the way we function. And I've had the opportunity over the last few years to have these very open, candid conversations about, he was traumatized growing up, but he loves his father to death. Grandfather's been dead for almost 50 years. When he talks about his father and how harsh he was, he doesn't take note of that. For him, his father, he loved his father. The harshness was just the reality of being a parent, right? So a lot of these kids are growing up in this quote unquote dysfunctional homes, right? Experiencing trauma at home. And then they go out to the world and it's layered. And no one's actually having any conversations with them on how to deal with it, right? So what happens after 20 plus years, 30, 40, or in some instances, in my case, 50 years of experiencing trauma, and then all of a sudden somebody tells you, this is what you're going through, this is trauma, right? If we talked about this is why it's important that we understand it, because people deal with this in very different ways. And generally, if you don't understand what you've been through, then you impose it on somebody else. We start talking about community trauma, it's very important that we understand the history that these communities have gone through and these people have gone through, and not understanding, right, where it's from. So I talk very openly about this, and I always reference this case. When I was in college, I had a young man named Mike. I volunteered at the school at the tutoring mentoring program, and I think he was probably in the 5th grade. In the 5th grade, everybody knew what his circumstances were, right? And at that time, this must have been like in 90 or 91. Like everybody knew, and everybody said, you know what? Trajectory of this man's life, we can already forecast it. So spent some years, graduated from college, worked for a year, went to law school, stayed for a few years in New York, came back. I was working as a probation officer. Lo and behold, who was in the court with over a page of criminal history, same young man, right? So my question to everybody's always been, the trauma is real. We're at a place now where we're speaking about it, we understand it. If we know at that early age, and if you know people who teach elementary school, they'll tell you some kids as early as 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, people are having these kind of conversations. Oh yeah, that's Johnny. He's gonna end up so-and-so. And not unremarkable. 10, 15 years later, that person we already knew was gonna be in this situation is in the exact same situation. So for me, the question is, the layers of trauma start at home. They go into society, they experience it. Their parents, oftentimes in the homes that they grow up in, don't understand the kind of trauma they're imposing on these kids. And sometimes they grow up in communities that have their own trauma, and it's layered. 20, 30 years later, how do we invest in these communities, these individuals, these homes, so that we stop this cycle? That's always been my question, right? And for me, anybody who's a police officer will tell you, I'm very open. I tell people, if you grew up under the same circumstances, you could do no better. And I know this firsthand, right? We grew up under these outrageous circumstances. Like most people, there's no way I could survive that, right? But yet and still there are people passing judgment. And I tell people very openly, if you robbed a bank and you robbed somebody, hit them over the head, despite your trauma, I'm gonna lock you up, right? Because that's not something I have discretion about, and I'm not sure that I would give you a pass. But for me, it's really, how do we move on? How do we treat that person in a humane way and provide services to help ensure that they're not repeating that cycle of their own?
Thoughts, reactions to anything our friends have said?
I'll just go, and it's seeing that we're in a psychologically safe space. So what resonated with me a lot was talking about, right, like individual trauma and going through the 3 E's there, and how do we transfer those skills over to then talking about collective and community trauma. And, you know, I just think of recently with March 16th and the Atlanta spa shootings, and in New York City, 3 weeks later, folks that look just like me, in age groups and everything, we've lost Michelle Go, Julia Lee, and Christina Lee. And seeing that, like, I didn't realize like how much I was holding into, you know, when you're sharing about with your nephew, it was like, it just all came out. And I just wonder, at the individual level, like I was ready to say, I think I'm experiencing like X, Y, and Z. But then when I think about, well, or wanted to hear your thoughts of how do we acknowledge the different level of readiness in a community setting, and we're thinking about a collective trauma. You know, I was trying to talk to my mom and she's like, I don't want to relive this. Like, I don't want to talk about it, even though that she knew that it was traumatic for her, but level of readiness wasn't where I'm at. So just wanted to hear kind of like, how do we, or your thoughts of like, how do we address the level of readiness when we're thinking about community trauma or collective trauma?
Thank you for that question. That's just a wonderful question. So one of the things that we do, so my background is in social work, right? And one of the things that we say is meet people where they're at. So one of the things that's lost immediately when you experience a traumatic event is your sense of power and safety and trust, right? And we try to reestablish that and give you as much power as possible. And there is power in choices. So if somebody's not ready to address certain things, then that's okay. And we wait till they get there. But one of the things that we have to do is thinking about giving opportunities to address trauma in the way people want them to be addressed or will receive. I'll give you an example. So prior to working at the district attorney's office, I ran a program called Boston Trauma Response. And what we did was respond to homicides in the community from a multi-pronged approach. So one aspect of it was providing clinical services to the survivors of homicide. And the other aspect of it was providing community support. So my staff, we would go up to funerals and support the attendees of the funerals. But what we noticed what was happening is that in the first kind of couple months in the aftermath of a homicide, whether it's weeks or months, there's a lot of support. Right? There's a lot of people around reaching out to families, providing that, and then it starts to trickle down. And so we wanted to provide opportunities to intervene and provide the supports in the immediate aftermath, in the short term and long term. Because what we know is that with trauma, everybody's going to have a different response, but the response can also be late. So somebody may have a traumatic reaction within minutes of the event. Other people may be like years later, and all of a sudden they're flooded with all this emotion and don't know why. And then this memory comes back, oh my God, this happened to me, right? And so we want to make sure when we're thinking about intervening, whether it's from an individual perspective, community perspective, that we're allowing for resources that exist in a comprehensive way so that people know when they're ready, they can access it. And resources have to be available in the most culturally sensitive or with cultural humility. I have a problem with the word cultural competence, because I don't know how you ever be competent completely. So I'll call it with cultural humility and understanding, right? And so making sure, like, if I have a client that comes to me and I don't, like, you don't even speak the same language, how can I expect them to kind of work with me in the way that they feel safe enough to kind of share, right? And so in regards to that piece around, like, how do we assess readiness to address trauma? I think that's a hard question. We gotta kind of make sure people know that resources exist, and when they're ready to access it, allow them to do so. And that comes with acknowledgement and awareness and education, so that people actually know that these things.
It seems one of the interesting things I heard all three of you say in different ways was that having insight into the trauma, whether personally or as a community, seems to be vital to determine how you would respond to that trauma. And it seems, you know, given where we are, that is actually a place for collaboration between higher ed and the community, right? Is to say, we can explore these topics together, right? Whether it is sort of the history of oppression or decisions that were made, you know, about policy or whatever within the city, and understand how those things influence people's behavior or set a context for the behavior. So when we're thinking about it on the tail end, whether we're thinking punitively or otherwise, being court involved, we can, you know, it seems like there's actually an interesting moment there to sort of marry the needs of insight that's required into trauma with the skills and abilities of the university. Does that make sense? Or
I think to me, before you can get any services, it's understanding that where you're at and you need the services, right? You have to recognize that you need it. A lot of people just don't. A lot of people just don't. Again, a lot of this has to do with education, right? I think in the 80s, primarily, the only people who talked about therapy, counseling, generally didn't look like me. There were people who had a lot of money, who had access to those services. And within the Black community, there was a certain stigma attached. And not, still there, still is, but we're moving ahead. So how do we change this mindset that there's something wrong with that, and have people understand that, you know, our parent, I know my father was like, listen, this is just how life is. You deal with it and you figure out, you move on, right? And all the while you're holding all this stuff in, and then all of a sudden somebody tells you, you know what? There's something to the way that you feel. Like when you encounter these situations, and, you know, for you, depending on how you're raised, that's just not being tough, right? Not being resilient, if you will. So I think it's important that we start having these community conversations so that people understand that if they've been feeling a certain way for a long time, and whatever it is that they're feeling is impacting how they navigate the world, how they interact with their friends, family, and others, then there may be something they need to look into. And once they realize that, trying to convince them that it's worth the investment to go and have a conversation with somebody that can help them kind of unearth some of that stuff.
Yeah, I would agree with my colleagues, absolutely. And our agency, when you talk about the stigma and people realizing that they're living with it, again, I agree that some people don't even recognize that their actions or behaviors are called something, and part of it could be called trauma. Obviously, there's lots of other mental health issues that families face. But I think it is a matter of feeling safe enough to be able to be open to support and help. But that safety is generated in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it just means a matter of like our agency, on the ground floor, we have a child care center, early education and care center, and upstairs is our behavioral health department. So when families come in with a child that has behavioral health issues or a parent that it needs some support, they don't know if they're going in to pick up their 2-year-old or if they're going upstairs to see their clinician. And that anonymity right on Dudley Street has been helpful for people to feel safe, that they can walk in, nobody's judging them like, oh, that's the clinic, or, you know, it's a subtle thing, but it's an important thing. Again, meeting people, like Charlene said, you know, meeting people where they are is really important, and non-judgment. So I had another really important point that I can't remember. So anyway.
I just wanted to add something to what you said. So, so safety is generated in many ways, right? And so when we think about even the reason why you're in this room today, we're looking at it from public health perspective, public safety, perspective. So safety is generated in policy, right? Safety is generated in kind of access to resources. So when we talk about communities in Roxbury, like you mentioned, having to go out of weight or Foxborough, that sends a message.
Yeah.
You don't care about my healthcare. You don't care about my safety because you didn't think about me having the ability to access that, right? So safety is not just limited to kind of physical and emotional, but thinking about the policies that impact the way that we can live our lives. We're thinking about the simplest things like, you know, you can go to certain parts of Boston and the streets are pristine, right?
Yeah.
The trash gets picked up on time. There are no potholes, right? And other parts of the community, it looks terrible. It looks awful. So you don't care about my environmental safety, right? So when we think about a public safety perspective and trauma, those are things that have to be considered as well.
Can I just add to that too? I was absolutely appalled when you talk about, when I think about systemic ways in which communities are marginalized. And again, I see almost, not everything, but a lot of things through the lens of civil rights. There's been a lot of talk about sort of institutional racism. And I was appalled when President Biden signed the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill into law for the first time. Like, what does that tell a community, not just Black people, but anybody, that the federal government did not recognize that lynching a human being should have been a federal crime, a federal hate crime, until 2022. And they're on the lawn celebrating this, and how many people have died in that horrific way. And our federal government was like, oh, 422 years later, we'll recognize it. And I don't, if that is not systemic, I don't know what is. And it makes you think like, that is so obvious. Like, who is digging down deep enough to understand the environmental impact and what that says to communities and how that traumatizes communities? Last thing I'll say about this is when people are surviving every day, the amount of resiliency that it takes to survive under horrific and traumatic situations is exhausting. And until you can give a person a breath to even consider, like, oh, this is why I can't sleep, or oh, this is why I have these intermittent bursts of crying. Like I didn't know that was coming, and you're on the bus and you start crying, you know, like, until you can give people who don't have the wherewithal to say, oh, I'm not feeling great, let me go see my therapist, who don't have that access. I think it's important to be able to give somebody enough time and space. I always say, so we run homeless shelters for families. And when you're talking to a family and like, oh, it'd be great, we could send your kids to Disney World. What? I want to know where I'm going to sleep tonight and eat. Like, that sounds fun and that's cute, but I am surviving. So when you think about your basic human needs, to feel safe, to have a roof over your head, to be able to eat, you're not thinking about all the things, all the traumas, all the happenings that put you in a position where you got 3 kids, Your husband just passed away. 2 weeks ago, I had a house. I was living good. I had a refrigerator full of food. He passes away, the income is gone, and now I'm coming to you for housing? And you want me to think about what? Like, so to understand when you talk about who's ready to receive support, how you allow them to be even open to it, it's, I think, paramount to, again, sort of understand where the individual is, the circumstances around that individual, and you know, how best to create a safe enough space for people to even breathe, to even step back, to say, like, this, you know, these things are happening for a real reason.
So that was big. So, because we're talking about trauma in Boston at scale. So how would we do this, right? So when you think about the services that government has available, or the way the government works now, is that there's a series of programmatic interventions offered by a whole range of different agencies, but they don't see a lot of these things. They see when someone breaks a crime, or they see when somebody, or when they get a house, or they don't pay the rent, or what have you. So how do we take this more holistic view of people in trauma, given all of the point of kind of transactional moments that the government has with the community? How should we be thinking of this?
Yeah, but yeah, she-
Oh, you can see.
We have several questions.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Like 3 questions.
Please do. Yeah.
Well, I don't have a question. You asked earlier how was what I was learning landing, and I just wanted to applaud all 3 of you. What I'm hearing is that it's relational, one, it's contextual, it's historical. And for me, when dealing with, I do embody racial equity work, so he's in the room with the good people. But this idea that human beings across race certainly are always shaping themselves towards safety, belonging, and dignity. Without any of those 3 things, you are not moving forward. And I heard in the ways in which you each spoke so eloquently about it, that dignity was being brought in, that safety was being brought in with this sense of belonging. And so when I think about the idea of scaling up, I think it's important to remember that it's all relational. You do not have a relationship with the community, or have a relationship with someone who has a relationship with the community. If you do not understand the historical and persistent context in which people are in the world and living, that is going to be challenging, and certainly meeting these just immediate needs. Those immediate needs speak specifically to safety. If I can't eat, right, it's not happening. So I was really just saying, and yes, I work at Dudley too. Right, see you, it's so wonderful. Do I do trauma-based work healing? And I'm just loving to see the whole smile. You know,
I'll take it.
Well, here's-
everything that you said about this context of, you know, it's the historical, right? You were talking about the historical and the intergenerational trauma. I wanted to ask a question about epigenetics and how, where that falls in the lens and how you all see trauma, because that is the space in which I am at, and how neuroscience is now here to support all of the work that we're doing.
I'll briefly talk about it, but so we know that trauma is, there's the transmission of trauma through genetics, right? That's part of kind of what we're talking about, intergenerational trauma and historical trauma. When Superintendent Eddy, when Eddy was speaking about that specific thing about it, he gave an example about his father, right? And so part of genetics adaptation, right? you're genetically adapting to certain things. So I think about his dad, when you were talking about the story, that's just the way things are. You get up and you just do what you gotta do, right? When we think about, because he doesn't know this, but I think he thinks, oh, yes, we have the same people. So when I think about kind of, I'm sorry if I'm going off what you've asked. When I think about kind of historically where my family came from, right? And we know kind of, they came from Africa and they were, you know, they came to Haiti. But there's something about kind of being, being enslaved, right? And when you are enslaved, you have to get up and just keep on doing what you got to do, right? No matter what has happened to you, right? And so we've adapted in that way, right? Where generations later, there's still the thing, well, you got to suck it up and do what you got to do. Where did that come from, right? And why do we adapt in that way? You can actually trace it back to that time, right? Where you might have been assaulted, you might have been harmed and beaten, you still got to go and do what you got to do because the master has said so, right? And so there's that transmission that happens and we adapt in that way. So like, you know, your father didn't just wake up one day and say, we just got to do what we got to do. No, that was transmitted generationally through genetics, right? And so I don't know if I get into some of that, but my thoughts on that.
No, this idea that it's happening in a historical context. I think that is what also gets missed, and then of course all of the systems and structures that are in place that maintain it, and how much all the internalization of it.
I think it's a question over.
I have different questions, but just thinking about that, how things are inherited. We're talking about the ways that trauma is inherited and that responses are inherited. But also then I think, especially when I think individual versus community, then it's like a question of scale, and I wonder what comes to mind in terms of the other side, where you actually are interrupting that process or addressing it, or just providing an alternative setting that if it's a note, if that's a community experience, that's what happens more like an individual level. I mean, when you were talking about how you need to, like an individual needs to recognize it himself with the help, you're also saying that there's a lot of community recognition of that person. And you know, if that community recognition is continually provided, that might help that person given that space too. I was thinking like how are communities finding ways to inherit new ways of thinking about this and new ways of responding to the same situations that, you know, without that kind of help, are just going to kind of keep reproducing themselves.
I think at the end of the day, it's education. Education and the wherewithal to get those resources. That's my perspective. Maybe some people who differ, but I know where I stand today just based on level of education I have as compared to my father who had like maybe an elementary school education and my mother who doesn't read or write. So as you become more aware, you're able to access resources, access information, and hopefully that takes you to someplace else.
I would say this idea of scaling up to community. I'm from Ohio originally and moved here too many years ago, a long time ago. And in Boston, and if you're from Boston, I do not mean to insult you, but there was this real sense, I still, in some ways, what is my community, right? People ask me all the time, what high school did you go to? I think I saw you at, like, did you go to O'Brien? I was like, what is it? No. I was like, no, I didn't go there, you know. What is community? And having lived and worked in Roxbury, Dorchester for the last 20 plus years, community is changing, right? It's changing because of some of the social economic systems that are in place, gentrification that is happening. So neighbors are different, homeowners are selling their homes and they're becoming, you know, 3 separate condos that you know, people historically in that community can't afford. And so community really is changing. And we're starting a program called the Front Porch, and it really is just a concept that in a community, a lot of people sit on their front porch, you kind of chat, get to know your neighbors. And that, where does that exist anymore? And CSR is trying to recreate that element of building and creating community. And it changes. And I don't know how to scale it up where there isn't this sense of shared experience, right? Because my experience, having always lived on Bowdoin Street, always, you know, grew up there, have seen all the changes, you know, and then somebody moving in next door who, you know, wants to live in Roxbury because it's closer to downtown and bought $1 million condo or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, I don't have that shared experience. And where does that kind of communication happen? And we have to create spaces for it. And I honestly don't know. I think you have to create community. So I can say that for our agency, I think of, whether it's my staff, 400 people, like that's a lot of people who all have children, who have spouses, who have extended families, that if I can give opportunity to them, I've created a community. If as an employer, I can give them, you know, career development, like pathways to more money to a career as opposed to a job, then I'm hoping to have impact in different ways. And then they all have caseloads of families in the community that they then can, you know, so that community has this ripple effect, right? So in that small way, but I think recognizing, defining what a community is significant.
And I'll just say this short thing. I think there has to be a collective acknowledgement of the trauma in order to be a collective effort to address it, right? So that means that, you know, you don't have to have the experience of the trauma itself to acknowledge that it happened, or to acknowledge that harm occurred. Again, when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about harm. So you cannot be there and say, wow, this community was harmed, right? And then we can kind of think about what are the things, and it has to be, we all do different things here, but we can all kind of utilize our resources and skill sets to address the harm that has impacted the community. So I think that the collective effort has to be done together, but you have to acknowledge that it even exists and it happened.
I just want to say thank you all for your incredible service. I think both this conversation is really has been really powerful, and thank you for sharing all of your perspectives, but more importantly, thank you for all of what really is service work that you've been doing for so long. I wanted to go back to the story you told about that young man that you encountered in 5th grade. And I'm curious, between 20 or 30 years ago, whenever you met him, and now, what has changed about the way that systems and supports exist for someone like him? And if you look forward 20 to 30 years, what more do you hope will have changed in the way that the community and systems and government and programs exist to support someone like him?
Unfortunately, I don't think the systems have changed much. I think maybe there may be a few more services available. But I think in terms of coordination of services, which I always talk about, people are still functioning in silos. The Boston Public Schools, they're Boston Public Schools. They don't necessarily have a conversation with DCF, right? And if that young man or woman, whoever it is, ends up in the custody of DYS, there's not necessarily a conversation. And I hope that if there's some kind of family counseling or therapy that's going on, that they would access all those resources. I just don't think it happens. Like for me, over the last 2 years, and I'm gonna take this another step, I think we've been talking a lot about trauma, we talk about systemic racism, but we're focused on small pieces of the system. And until we're able to really expand our lens and look at systems as a whole, I think we're still gonna end up, we'll be having this conversation for a long time. Really, for me, the bigger conversation, how do we change systems, not bits and pieces of the system. Like I know over the last 2 years, there's been hyper focus on criminal justice reform, right? And I was on a radio show 2 years ago, and I said, you know what, if we hyper focus on criminal justice reform, we're gonna miss some of the other markers. And for me, a classic example of that was a few months ago when the NFL spent millions of dollars investing in, signs and, Black Lives Matter. And they were at the epicenter of racism against a Black man, right? So we talk about systems, it's like, yes, Mike, there should be more resources, but how do we change these systems so that people are not, you go from home to school, to services, to the criminal justice system. And even if you succeed, right, quote unquote succeed, you end up as a high ranking coach in the NFL, you're still fighting those same systems. So for me, the bigger question is always systems as opposed to individual silos as it relates to schools, politics, or what have you.
So I love this question that you posed at the beginning, right? Like, how do you think about addressing like trauma on the community level? I think what you're getting to, like, is a bigger systems issue. And, I think it makes sense to people, whether you're a clinician or not, like what a person, an individual who experiences trauma might need in order to like heal, recover, thrive, whatever. And so I'm wondering, like, on a kind of a policy level, if there are examples that have happened, or if you could envision changes that would enable communities who, whether or not they acknowledge the trauma, but have that room or the conditions in which to like breathe, as you say, like they just like, are there policy like dreams that you would have, or like sweeping kind of systemic changes? I don't know, maybe this is like a magic wand question.
I see where you're going. Open, honest conversation, right? And I think all too often we have these superficial conversations and we really try to get to the root of the problem, right? And I'll give you an example. I work in internal affairs. I supervise the three supervisors who supervise other people, are 3 white men, right? And I had a conversation about a situation where I felt that it was based in racism. And he got upset. He stopped talking for a whole week. And he said, wow, well, where did you get this from? I said, I got it from my 50 years of being a Black man and walking through life in these shoes. So you don't necessarily need to understand it, but I'm telling you, I don't have enough to put it on paper and charge that person with bias. And it literally took him 2 weeks before he finally came and he said, I was really upset with you because you said this was racism. So for me, when we start talking about systems and changing systems, is how do we as people have open, honest conversations? And I know it's tough, right? If you as a white man and you're in a room and you say something that other people may perceive as you being kind of like far right, do we have room to kind of say, okay, let's educate him as opposed to holding that over your head? But if I tell you, you did this to me and it made me feel a certain way, that you say, okay, you know what? I don't necessarily understand it, but I'm gonna have to focus on what it is that I did, that I said or did to you, and how I can change that. Open, honest conversation. I don't know if we're at a place we talk about it superficially. I don't know that we're at a place where we can have these conversations yet.
I would just push back on one thing you just said. Like, you mentioned where we can educate you, but I think even people are on a very different spectrum, and it is hard, but to hear why and how that, hear from that person as well, where that perspective is coming from. And I think, these are, like you said, sort of the fairy tale kind of, is those open and honest conversations, sort of both ways, acknowledging the hurt and pain in some way. You had talked about reducing our ego in that, my pain is worse than your pain, or, and having conversations. But I think at its base is recognizing our own humanity, everybody's humanity, right? Because when we were talking about DV, domestic violence earlier, and I was at a workshop once and they said when I'm gonna say man, but I know domestic violence happens between all kinds of people. But if a man, once he starts calling you out your name, it's easier to hit you. Like, I'm not Sandra anymore, it's the BI, right? Right? And so when we become like just something else, if you become just that Black neighborhood or that white neighborhood or that right wing or left wing or whatever, then it's easier to fill in other blanks and be more hurtful. But if you say, oh, that's Sandra. Hey, Sandra, let's have a conversation. I know you don't think like I think, but you see and recognize the humanity. We're both going to be at a conference next week, and this is part of what I was thinking about for that conference, but you'll get a preview. If it doesn't work, let me know. But the sanitation workers in Memphis back in I want to say it's 64. Am I right? So I got to get that right. But anyway, so I'm practicing here. But they wore signs. Does anybody know what they said? Now I feel like I'm lecturing. I'm a man. Now these are people fighting for their jobs, fighting for, equal pay, for opportunity, fighting to take care of their families. And they didn't write on the sign like, give me equal pay, or recognize me as a human being who's entitled to fundamental rights, the fundamental things that everybody should have access to. And I can't have that conversation with you until you recognize me as a human, right? I am a man, and I would gladly wear that as woman as I am, hear me roar, I would wear it, to make the point of my humanity. And I think it gets lost when you layer on top of it, well, I'm not a racist, I never enslaved you. Well, but can you understand that happened? And I have this, what was the word you said? When trauma moves from epigenetics. I tried to write it down. I was trying, it's cute, the pen, I didn't. But anyway.
I would just say, if I had a magic wand, I would really focus on addressing just all the disparities that exist, like economic disparities, healthcare, education, because that's often in poverty. Those are the root often of kind of what we're seeing that's driving the community trauma. And so really getting to the root of those disparities amongst communities that lead to more and more trauma. So that would be just give me a lot of money and fix it.
So I think we are done on time. This was an amazing conversation. So can you all join me in